Guys, I think we are going to be starting this section, and others can join while we already start. So today we're going to be talking about the React essentials, components, common components of React. Okay, that's what we're going to be talking today. We're going to be watching it now, and if you have any question, drop it on the chat section, and after each section I will go and check it and answer your question. Okay, so let's start.
React Essentials course section, we're going to build this beautiful demo web application with React and from the ground up. And as you can see, this website has both static as well as dynamic interactive content. And therefore, along the way, whilst building this website, you will learn about the most important React features, the essentials you'll always need no matter which React app of whichever complexity you're going to build. And we'll get started by taking a look at one of the most important React concepts you can learn. We'll get started by exploring components and a couple of related concepts like JSX, working with props, and what all these things are and how to work with them as a React developer. You will also learn how to work with data in your React apps, how to output data, for example. And you will learn how to make your React apps interactive by reacting to user events like button clicks and by diving into another crucial React concept called state, which will be super important for turning static websites into dynamic interactive websites. And therefore, by the end of this section, you'll know about all these crucial, fundamental React concepts and how to use them. You'll be able to build basic React apps, both static and dynamic interactive ones, of course. And you need no prior React knowledge to get started. You just need that basic JavaScript knowledge because that's of course assumed for this entire course. React.
Okay, yeah, so just like I said, this is React Essentials, and he made us understand that you don't need any basic or prior React experience. All you need is a basic JavaScript experience, and we already taught that. So we're going to be diving into the lecture fully now. Okay, stay tuned.
And its ecosystem provide dozens of useful and important features and concepts, which, of course, are all going to be covered in depth throughout this course. But if you were forced to identify only one core concept, which you will need for all React apps, it would be the concept of working with components. Because components are potentially reusable building blocks which you as a React developer can create and which you then combine to build the overall user interface. So React apps are in the end built by combining components. And whilst a couple of additional features and concepts would be required to create truly interactive user interfaces, components are the one concept every React app, no matter its complexity, will use. And indeed, the idea of thinking of user interfaces as combinations of components is not unique or exclusive to React. If you visit any website of your choice, you'll quickly be able to identify a couple of key building blocks that make up the overall site or app. For example, in this demo website we're going to work on throughout this section, you could identify the header area, the key concept items, and the interactive tabs section as components. You could also identify more or less components because, as you will also learn in this section and this course, it will come down to the developers who are working on an app to define how big or small a component should be. But the idea behind those components really just is that they wrap HTML and possibly also CSS code, as well as any related JavaScript logic that might be needed, and together those languages and code pieces then define and control a part of the UI. This allows you, the developer, to split up complex user interfaces into smaller, more manageable parts, which, at least potentially, may also be reused in different places of the UI. For example, this core concept component is used 4 times, just configured with different data, but using the same HTML markup and styling and JavaScript logic under the hood. And that's one of the main reasons why this components approach is so powerful and popular. Without components, you would quickly end up with rather large and complex HTML files that may become difficult to navigate and work with. In addition, a change in your code might need to be applied in different parts of your application, hence increasing the likelihood of errors. When using this components approach, you're instead reusing code and you only need to make such a change in one place. Another big advantage of this components idea is that related code can be stored together. Because without components, you would typically have your markup in the HTML file and your JavaScript code in one of your JavaScript files. If you needed to make a change to the JavaScript code, you would therefore have to switch back and forth between those files all the time. And since you're likely working in different files, and it's quite possible that you're not seeing all the related code together all the time, it's also quite likely that you might accidentally break your code because you maybe changed something in your JavaScript code that then would have also required a change in the HTML code. On the other hand, when working with components, related code is typically kept closely together is typically kept closely together and that's one of the main reasons why this components approach is so powerful and popular. Without components, you would quickly end up with rather large and complex HTML files that may become difficult to navigate and work with. In addition, a change in your code might need to be applied in different parts of your application, hence increasing the likelihood of errors. When using this components approach, you're instead reusing code and you only need to make such a change in one place. Another big advantage of this components idea is that related code can be stored together. Because without components, you would typically have your markup in the HTML file and your JavaScript code in one of your JavaScript files. If you needed to make a change to the JavaScript code, you would therefore have to switch back and forth between those files all the time. And since you're likely working in different files, and it's quite possible that you're not seeing all the related code together all the time, it's also quite likely that you might accidentally break your code because you maybe changed something in your JavaScript code that then would have also required a change in the HTML code. On the other hand, when working with components, related code is typically kept closely together, hence simplifying the development process. And the last major advantage of working with components is that you follow a design and development principle, which is almost always a good idea. You have a separation of concerns. Different components do different things and handle different parts of the UI. For example, in the demo project of this section, we have components that are responsible for outputting information, and we have other components that are responsible for switching between tabs and handling user input. And that's of course just a basic app. The more complex your projects become, the more useful this pattern becomes, as it also simplifies the process of working on the same project with multiple developers, where every developer works on their own feature area, for example. And that's why this idea of working with components is embraced by React, and why, as a React developer, you will create and use hundreds and thousands of such components also in this course. And just as a side note, it's not just React. This concept is so popular and useful that you'll also find it in other popular front-end frameworks like Angular, Vue, or Svelte. And you'll also find it outside the world of web development, for example, in mobile development frameworks like Flutter. So let's therefore now take a look at a first React component in code, and then of course also create a first component.
Hi guys. Okay, I think a whole lot of people has joined. Alina, welcome to the call. Welcome, AVA. Oh, your name is very wonderful. Welcome to the call. Alina, I don't know what happened the last time we were trying to debug the Solana Developer Challenge, and yeah, Don't know what happened. We'll talk about that later. So this class, right, I'm seeing questions on the chat. Let me quickly read it. Okay. um you want me to maximize my video? Why? Like to make it bigger or smaller? What? I don't get that. Okay, Tiago, let's know what you're saying. Okay, so we just started learning the React Essential today, and he's talking about how related it is with HTML and CSS and JavaScript that we already did. So I'm gonna be waiting for your questions. Do well to ask questions. Yeah. So Tiago, we're waiting for you to type your question, and then yeah. Okay, that's taking time. Um, I hope this. If you are here and you are hearing the video, you saw the video and it is clear, please indicate on the chat session. Oh, sorry about that. I'm gonna try and make that bigger. But the thing is, sometimes when I make it bigger, it interrupts the flow of the video because the network, it differs when the screen is bigger and when the screen is smaller. It differs, the network consumption differs. So I'm gonna make it bigger now. Okay, great. I'm gonna try and make it bigger now. So I'll come back and check the chat session after the next um video session ends. Okay. Okay, I guess this is the highest it can go. Let's see. Let's see. So if there's any network interruption, do exercise patience because yeah, we're trying to use the bigger screen type. Okay, we're trying to we expanded it, so if the network is interrupted, hold on a little because it will still go back to normal. So let's try it out.
Now that we know what the general idea behind components is and why working with components is so popular, it's time to switch to a React project and get started with components and with writing code there. And therefore, attached to this lecture, you find a code sandbox link to a React project I prepared for you, which is the starting project for the demo project we're going to work on throughout this section. Now, if you don't want to use this browser-based environment, and if you instead prefer to follow along locally, you can also use this alternative zip file, which you also find attached, which once you download it and extracted it, will of course give you that same starting project. Now just a project which you can use and run locally on your system. If you go for this local option instead of using Code Sandbox, you should open this extracted folder with any code editor of your choice, for example, Visual Studio Code. And then there, in that project, you first of all have to run npm install in your system terminal navigated into that project folder. This command will download and install any third-party packages needed by this project. For example, the React libraries and the build process tools that watch and transform the React code to code that works in the browser. Because, as mentioned in the first course section, by default, the code you write in React projects would not run in the browser. Now, after successfully running npm install, which is something you only need to do once, you can run npm run dev to start the development server. This development server will allow you to visit a preview website where you can see your React app in action. You should keep this development server process up and running for as long as you are working on this project, because behind the scenes, this process will watch your code and reload that preview website whenever you make changes to the code. You find that preview website by visiting this address that's output after running npm run dev. As mentioned, it's the same starting project and therefore the same demo website as you find it in that code sandbox environment. There, if you are using code sandbox, you don't need to run npm install or npm run dev, because code sandbox will do that for you. Now, in your local project, you can quit this running development server with Ctrl+C whenever you're done for the day. And if you then want to start coding again, you can simply restart it by running npm run dev again. Again, this is all not required if you're using the code sandbox environment. So now with that starting project up.
Okay, just like I said, after every session, I'm going to pause to see if you have any questions. I can't see any question here, so we're going to continue from, because he's continuing from where he stopped on the other video, okay? Let's go back and continue.
Up and running, you'll find a couple of files and folders in that project folder. For example, you'll find an index.html file in that folder. But if you open that file, you'll see that it's pretty empty though. It only contains some basic markup, but it definitely does not contain the HTML code that's responsible for displaying the content we're seeing on the screen. The image, the title, and so on. And the reason for that, of course, is that React is rendering this content on the screen, that React is responsible for bringing something onto the screen. And we can see in that index.html file that it does indeed load a JavaScript file. It includes this index.jsx file. Now let's ignore that strange extension .jsx for now, and instead take a look at that file. As we can see here, we find it in this src, this source folder, and if we open it, we do indeed find some JavaScript code in that file. But we still don't see anything that seems to be related to that image or title we're seeing on the website. Instead, besides other things, which we will explore later, this file imports something from the app.jsx file. And this file finally does contain the markup for the content we're seeing on the screen. Though this file actually contains code that might be a bit confusing if you take a closer look, because it seems to contain HTML code inside of a JavaScript function, so inside of JavaScript code. And it also got this strange extension .jsx. Well, this file, as well as the index.jsx file, has this extension because it is a JavaScript file that uses non-standard JavaScript syntax. To be precise, it uses a JavaScript syntax extension called JSX, which conveniently simply stands for JavaScript Syntax Extension. And this extension allows developers to describe and create HTML elements by writing HTML markup code inside of JavaScript files. And since React will be about describing and creating user interfaces and parts of user interfaces, this is a very useful feature. But whilst it is a nice feature and therefore used in base.
Okay, guys, so sorry, we're gonna get a little network disrupt. The network is gonna be disrupted a little.
HTML elements by writing
Hello, guys. Is there any question? It's echoing. I just switched my internet now because I noticed that it paused. So do we have any question? I don't understand echoing. When did it start? Okay, at 9. Okay. So let's check it. Let me quickly switch my internet back and see what happens. Can you hear me, please? If you can hear me, kindly indicate in the chat section. Like, can you hear me now? Not previously, not 2 minutes ago. I switched the internet. Okay. I'll play the video back to see if you can hear me. If you can hear the video. Okay, let me quickly play it again. Then after the video section, I'll come back to this chat to see if you're still encountering that echo and all. So I guess we have to start from the beginning because that was echoing.
With that starting project up and running, you'll find a couple of files.
So did you hear now? Was it still echoing now? I want to be sure before I go on. I just played it a little now and paused. Is it still echoing? Okay, peculiar. It's not echoing on your end. Oh wow, the echo is still there with Okay. Let's just manage it that way since you can still hear while the echo, because I don't know why it's echoing. I don't know why it's echoing. Come in, let me quickly see if there's something running in the background. Okay. What's this? Okay. There's nothing running in the background. You okay? Let's just continue. Since you can still hear.
So now with that starting project up and running, you'll find a couple of files and folders. So now with that starting project up and running, you'll find a couple of files and folders in that project folder. For example, you'll find an index.html file in that folder. But if you open that file, you'll see that it's pretty empty though. It only contains some basic markup, but it definitely does not contain the HTML image, the title, and so on. And the reason for that, of course, is that React is rendering this content on the screen, that React is responsible for bringing something onto the screen. And we can see in that index.html file that it does indeed load a JavaScript file. It includes this index.jsx file. Now let's ignore that strange extension .jsx for now and instead take a look at that file. As we can see here, we find it in this src, this source folder, and if we open it, we do indeed find some JavaScript code in that file. But we still don't see anything that seems to be related to that image or title we're seeing on the website. Instead, besides other things, which we will explore later, this file imports something from the app.jsx file. And this file finally does contain the markup for the content we're seeing on the screen. Though this file actually contains code that might be a bit confusing if you take a closer look, because it seems to contain HTML code inside of a JavaScript function, so inside of JavaScript code. And it also got this strange extension .jsx. Well, this file, as well as the index.jsx file, has this extension because it is a JavaScript file that uses non-standard JavaScript syntax. To be precise, it uses a JavaScript syntax extension called JSX, which conveniently simply stands for JavaScript Syntax Extension. And this extension allows developers to describe and create HTML elements by writing HTML markup code inside of JavaScript files. And since React will be about describing and creating user interfaces and parts of user interfaces, this is a very useful feature. But whilst it is a nice feature and therefore used in basically all React projects and also many non-React projects, it is a feature that's not supported by browsers. So the code you see in the index.jsx and app.jsx files would not work in browsers. Instead, the code you write as a React developer is transformed behind the scenes by the development server, in this case here, before it reaches the browser. It's transformed to code that does work in the browser. But as a developer, thanks to this JSX extension, you have this more convenient way of describing the user interface. But what's really important about this app.jsx file is that what we can see here is a React component. It is such a component I mentioned in previous lectures. And as you can see in React, a component is really just a JavaScript function. Though in order to be recognized and used as a component by React, it's a function that must follow two important rules. The function name must start with an uppercase character, and the function must return a renderable value, typically the to be rendered HTML markup. So this JSX code you see here. And that's really all. This is how components are created in React. You create a regular JavaScript function, give it a suitable name that starts with an uppercase character, and return some JSX code. And with that, let's now finally create our first custom component. Of course.
Okay, guys, going back to the. I hope we understand and we were able to hear clearly. This is just a check before I go or before I start the next video. Let me hear a yes or a no if you're following me, or if you have any question, kindly drop it. Great. I need another yes before we go on. Great, so I guess we are good to go.
Of course, when building React apps, you're not limited to this one app component. Instead, you can and typically will build and use your own components, dozens and hundreds of your own components. For example, in this basic demo app here, we could put this header related code into a new custom component to make this app component a bit leaner, and of course also to simply learn how to create custom components. Now, to build such a first custom component, we can stay in this app.jsx file for now, though later we'll actually put different components into different files. But to get started, let's add a new component by adding a new JavaScript function, because as you learned, React components are just JavaScript functions. So we can add this new function here above the app function, for example. And since it's just a normal JavaScript function, we can of course create that function with the function keyword and then give it any name of your choice. Just make sure that it starts with an uppercase character. For example, we could pick header as a name, because my goal here is to take this header markup and put it into a separate component. As a next, and in this case also already final step, we should then return a value inside of this newly created header function. And the returned value should be the content that should be displayed on the screen by this component. So in this case, this header markup here, this HTML code, you can cut this from the app component and paste it here into the header component. Now, when returning a multi-line JSX code snippet, as I have it here, you must wrap it with parentheses to, in the end, tell JavaScript that all this code here belongs together. Though, thankfully, when using VS Code, you typically don't have to do that manually, because if you simply press the Format Document shortcut, these parentheses should be added automatically for you. On Code Sandbox, this can also be done by pressing the shortcut or executing the Format Document command, or simply if you save the file there. And with that, we're done. This is our first custom component. Though at this point, we have defined it, but we're not using it yet. Now, normally in JavaScript, you would use a function by executing it like this. But that's not how you use a React component. Instead, it will be React, the library, that will under the hood execute these functions so that it understands what it should show on the screen. And therefore, we're not going to execute this function like this. Instead, the great thing about React and this JSX thing, this HTML in JavaScript code here, is that you can use your component functions like regular HTML elements inside your JSX code. So if you want to output the content of this header component as part of your app, you can go to that app component and use this header component function which we defined before like an HTML element inside of the apps component JSX code. For example, here, just make sure you get the naming right and you write header with an uppercase H, because that is how our component function was named. You can then either write it like this with an opening and a closing tag, or you can also take a shortcut and write a self-closing tag like this. Now, what's important to know and keep in mind about this self-closing syntax, though, is that if you're using this syntax, you always must have this / here at the end. For example, also when using this image tag, this built-in image element, there you also must have this / writing it like this would not be allowed, but thankfully, as you can see, you would also get an error if you would try to write it like this. So you always need that / also for your own custom components. But with that, if you save the app.js file and you reload your preview window, you should see the header again, this image, title, and subtitle. Which of course isn't an impressive change necessarily, because that's the content we saw before as well, But now we're seeing that result with our first custom component being used. And since, as mentioned before, you're going to work a lot with components in React, this of course is a crucial first step, because now you know how you can create your own components, and as you see, it's really not that difficult. Of course, we're going to add more features and learn about more related concepts, but in a nutshell, this is how you do build React components as a React developer.
Okay, guys, so this right here is just like a node file for the class that was just concluded. All this will be shared on the Discord channel, but before we go further, let me know if you have any other question before we go further. I don't like the fact that we're not asking questions because it looks like we're not following, but nevertheless, if you feel like you're following, let's continue.
So now the component, it's important to fully understand how that component's content ended up on the website and our screen. So as a first step, let's go to the website
So
and
now he wants to show you how the component, the last time you built your first React component, he showed you how to build your very first React component. So what he's trying to do here is to show you how that React component works. Okay, so yeah, let's continue.
let's inspect the source code of that website. If you do that, you'll note that you don't find the header or any other website content in that source code. No image, no titles, nothing. It just contains some metadata and at least one JavaScript import, one JavaScript file that's being loaded. But this loaded JavaScript file, the index JSX file in the end here in my case, is the key. Because the code that is loaded and executed here is in the end the transformed React code you wrote. Remember, I mentioned that the code you write wouldn't work like this in the browser, hence it's transformed. And it also shouldn't be too surprising that we see the index.jsx file being loaded here in the actual website source code, because that's also what we see here in our project in the index.html file. And in the end, it is this index.html file that's being served to the website visitors. Now, as you learned before, this index.jsx file does import something from the app.jsx file. It imports the app component, to be precise, because it's that app component that's being exported in that app.jsx file. By the way, this export keyword and this import keyword and this entire import-export feature is a regular JavaScript feature. It's not React specific. So it's this app component function that's being imported into the index.jsx file. And in this file, it's being used as JSX code here. Now, as you can see, we have no React component here though. This JSX code is not getting returned by some function. Instead, it's getting used as a value, as an argument for some other method that's being called here, the render method. And
like I said, this big screen is actually cracky. Like it consumes a lot of internet. That is why it's breaking at some points. So I think I'll take it back to the normal screen. Meanwhile, I think someone just joined. Welcome to the call if you just joined. We are talking about React here, and we are treating React components.
JSX code here. Now, as you can see, we have no React component here though. This JSX code is not getting returned by some
I'm going
function.
to be starting this. I'm going to go back to the beginning of this particular section. This particular section. Like I said, you're going to be, do you have any question? Like I said, we're going to be minimizing this to the way it was before. I don't know if you can see it, because I think the way it was previously was cracking. So guys, can you see the writing? Because I remember the last time there was complaints. Tiago said he could not see it. Okay, please, let's manage it this way, because when you make it a full screen, the network capacity will be low, and then it will be cracking and it will be stopping at some point, and I don't want that. So I'll be taking it back to the beginning.
Website content in that source code built a first custom component. It's important to fully understand how that component's content ended up on the website and our screen. So as a first step, let's go to the website and let's inspect the source code of that website. If you do that, you'll note that you don't find the header or any other website content in that source code. No image, no titles, nothing. It just contains some metadata and at least one JavaScript import, one JavaScript file that's being loaded. But this loaded JavaScript file, the index.jsx file in the end here in my case, is the key. Because the code that is loaded and executed here is in the end the transformed React code you wrote. Remember, I mentioned that the code you write wouldn't work like this in the browser, hence it's transformed. And it also shouldn't be too surprising that we see the index.jsx file being loaded here in the actual website source code, because that's also what we see here in our project in the index.html file. And in the end, it is this index.html file that's being served to the website visitors. Now, as you learned before, this index.jsx file does import something from the app.jsx file. It imports the app component, to be precise, because it's that app component that's being exported in that app.jsx file. By the way, this export keyword and this import keyword and this entire import-export feature is a regular JavaScript feature. It's not React specific. So it's this app component function that's being imported into the index.jsx file. And in this file, it's being used as JSX code here. Now, as you can see, we have no React component here though. This JSX code is not getting returned by some function. Instead, it's getting used as a value, as an argument for some other method that's being called here, the render method. And indeed, as a React developer, you will almost exclusively use JSX code inside of component functions. What we see here in the index.jsx file is the one important exception. Because this file, this index.jsx file, acts as the main entry point of our React app, since it is the first file to be loaded by the HTML file. And it's in this place where the React app boots up, you could say. To be precise, it's this special React DOM library, which in the end belongs to the overall React library, from which we're importing here, which ultimately renders this app component. So which is responsible for outputting the app component's content on the screen, you could say. And this app component is rendered by passing JSX code to this render method. This render method, however, is being called on an object that's created with another method, the createRoot method. This method takes an existing HTML element as an input, so an element that's not being created by React, but that instead is part of the index.html file already. In this case, that would be this div here with the ID root, since that's what we're selecting here with getElementById. That's what's getting passed to this createRoot method. And then with that element selected and set as a root for the React project, React goes ahead and injects a React component, the app component in this case, into this element, you could say. It renders this component and all its contents, including any nested components it may contain and their content, into this div. That's what this render method does. And that's why if you open the developer tools and there the elements tab, you see more than just the initial HTML structure. Instead, you see all the elements that are indeed visible on the screen. And you see that they are inside of that div here with the ID root. So the header and the main section, which is in the end simply the content defined in the app component, and our custom header component are inside of that div with the ID root. So the createRoot and render methods are responsible for rendering a single root component, the app component in this case, which then in turn may contain as many nested components as needed. And those nested components it may include, like this header component in this case, could then contain even more child components. And with that, ultimately, you end up with a component hierarchy which is often called a tree of components, a structure of components which is then rendered to the screen by React. But what's important to understand about this tree of components and components in general is that your custom components are not showing up in the actual rendered DOM though. There you only find default HTML elements. For example, here the header with the lowercase h, which is the built-in header element, not our custom component, which had an uppercase h. We also don't see the app component in here. So your tree of components is in the end just analyzed by React, and React then combines all the JSX code from all those components to generate the overall DOM, the elements that are showing up on the screen. But as a developer, you have the convenience of working with those individual building blocks instead of a single, potentially huge file that contains all the markup. And you can now also see why your component function names must start with an uppercase character. All built-in elements like div, image, or header start with lowercase characters. Custom components, on the other hand, so components built by you or other developers, must start with an uppercase character to tell React that it's not a built-in component. So that's how React tells custom components apart from built-in components. This does not just prevent potential name clashes, like for example here, where header with a lowercase h would clash with the built-in header, but it also changes how React handles a component. Built-in components like header, image, div, and so on are rendered as DOM nodes by React. On the other hand, custom components like our header here are just functions and are therefore executed as functions by React. And it then just takes a look at them, takes the returned value, the returned JSX code, and starts analyzing that code until it ends up with only built-in elements at a certain point of time, which are then rendered to the screen. And that's how React works, how it uses those components, and how it ultimately renders them onto the screen.
Okay, this is some quiz, but you don't need it now because we are just doing a class here. So we're quickly gonna move to the next section after the quiz. But before I do that, or should we try the quiz out? Let's try it out and see those who are participating. So we're gonna try this quiz out. Before we do that, I want to know if you have any question. Some people in the community are having issues with joining. I don't know why. This Discord is supposed to. I guess someone just joined. I think she just joined. Gwen, if I get that right. You are welcome to the call. Kindly mute yourself. Gwen. Okay, I'm coming. we have a quiz and we're going to be participating during that quiz. As many as you that joined at the beginning of the class, you are going to be answering the question from the quiz. I think, okay, it's not the person I thought joined. So let me quickly send the invite link. I don't know why they're not able to join. Let me send an invite link to them and go back to the quiz. So I need an answer, guys. If you're really following me, let's answer this question right here. It says from the perspective of a developer, what's one advantage of building a user interface by combining components? You all said you were participating. I want to see the answers. Choose between these sections. I want to see the person who's going to get the correct answer here. Okay? Let me quickly send the invite link back to the people in the channel. Okay, we are participating on this quiz, guys. I want to know who is really active. You said the second one. Should we try the second one out? Majority carries the vote. Let me know. Yes, you said that. Okay. Thiago is still following. He says is the second one. Which other person would like to participate? Because we are going with the second one now. Going. Okay, I think Elena is typing. Let me see and let me know if you are really participating. What do you think, Elena? Let's know. Type in the chat session. Let's know. Okay. Everybody says is the second one, the small reusable building block. Okay, I'm ticking the second one now and let's see. Let's check the answer. Great job, you guys answered correctly. That is beautiful. Okay, I think he has more questions, but we're going to be doing just one of them along the line during the class. If you have any other question, we will participate. So great one, guys. That just shows that you guys are focused and you understand what the instructor is talking about.
So now that
Before I go into the next question, let me see. Okay, that's the quiz. So prepare yourself. We are going into the next class. Let me see what's here.
that we built
Good job, guys. Let's continue the class.
our first component, before we're going to add more components. So now that we built our first component, before we're going to add more components, I want to explore how we can actually output dynamic content in such a component, so in our JSX code, instead of just outputting static content. To be precise here in this header component, I want to make sure that here we're not always saying fundamental React concepts, but that instead we sometimes also output crucial React concepts or core React concepts, so that we switch between these three words. And I want to switch between these options randomly. And that will be an important new feature that we add to our code here, because to achieve this goal, we need to output content dynamically. And that's in general something you will need to do a lot in React, and that's why we will learn how to do that in this lecture. Now, for that, attached you find a new app.jsx file, which you can simply use to replace your file with it. And if you do so, you'll see that it basically adds this code here, these 5 lines of code. And therefore, alternatively, you can of course also simply grab those lines of code and paste them into your app.jsx file. Now here in this code, I set up these words which I want to use, and I have a function which we can use to produce a random number. So in the end, a function which we can use to produce a random index, which we can then use to get access to these different possible words on a random basis. Now to do that, we can go to the place where the dynamic value will be needed, and that will be here in this header component function. Here, instead of always outputting fundamental, I want to output such a random word. And therefore, here in this JSX code, we now don't want a hard-coded value like fundamental or core, but instead we want to output a dynamic value. And that can be done in JSX and React by using curly braces. A single pair of curly braces, opening and closing. And when you add curly braces like this in your JSX code, either like this here between element tags, or possibly also as a value for an attribute, you tell JSX and React that you want to output a dynamic value. To be precise, you can now add any JavaScript expression of your choice between those curly braces. So any JavaScript expression code you put between those curly braces will be executed, and it will then be the value of that expression. So the result of that calculation here, for example, that will be output on the screen. So if I do add 1 plus 1 between those curly braces here, we therefore see 2 on the screen. That's how this works. And therefore, this curly brace syntax is of course super important, because it is the syntax that does allow us to blend our hard-coded content with dynamic values. Therefore, here we could reach out to React descriptions, so to this array here, which is stored in this React descriptions constant, and then access an element by index, And that index will now be produced with help of that getRandomInt function, which I'm executing here. This function takes one argument, the maximum value I want to produce. So here, in this case, since I have an index with 3 values, my maximum number I want to produce is 2 because the last element has an index of 2. So therefore here I pass 2 as an argument to getRandomInt. And it should be genRandomInt, of course, not getRandomInt, because genRandomInt is the function name. And if you then save this, you should see that you either have fundamental or crucial or also core as a word in front of React concepts here. So now this is regenerated every time you reload the page, since that's the point in time where this header component is created and rendered, and where this header component function is therefore executed by React. And that's therefore also the point in time where this code here is executed. You can, of course, also now pull that code out of your JSX code and store it in a variable or constant, which could be named description, like this, and then just refer to that variable or constant like this. This would keep your JSX code a bit leaner and move that JavaScript expression out of that code, which typically is considered a good practice. Even though the code before also worked, keeping your JSX code lean is typically preferred, and therefore you might want to go for this option, where you then only refer to the constant which stores the result of this expression here. Either way, the code works, and we can now switch between these different words by reloading the page.
Hi guys.
So now that we learned about outputting dynamic values,
Please, I'd like to know if you have any question on the chat section. Drop your question while we continue the section.
So now that we learned about outputting dynamic values with this special curly brace syntax, we can use that same syntax to load our images in a different way, or to point at those images in a different way. Now, of course, loading this image like this and displaying it works fine, as you can tell by the fact that the image is there. But this is actually not the best way of loading it. To be precise, this source attribute value is not the best way. Because here I'm pointing at the image in my SRC folder and there at the assets folder. But by loading it like this, the image might actually get lost once we prepare this React project for deployment. Now, deployment is something we'll take a look at later in the course, but as part of the deployment process, your entire code will be transformed, optimized, and bundled together. And image files, when loaded like this, might be ignored by that bundling process, and therefore they might get lost during deployment. In addition, if we include images differently, we can even take advantage of extra optimization steps which we're not getting with this way of including them. So, how should you then load and include images? Well, you should use an import statement. And you can, for example, import the React image, though this name here is totally up to you, from, and then you create a relative path from that file, so from the app.jsx file, this case, to the image file. So in this case, I dive into the assets folder, and then there it's this React Core Concepts PNG file. So I point at this file here, like this. And this approach might look rather strange, because importing an image file into a JavaScript file is not something you can normally do in JavaScript. But here this will work because of that same build process that will also make JSX code work. Basically, that build process will not just transform the JSX code, but also import statements like this. And also import statements like this here in the index.jsx file, by the way, where we import a CSS file, which also normally wouldn't work. But such imports do work in this project setup here, because the build process will make sure that the files we're importing here will be included in the final page and deployment package. And we can therefore use syntax like this to then use this React image, which we're loading like this, as a value for this source attribute by using single curly braces again. So by using this dynamic value syntax about which you learned. Here, the dynamic value for the source attribute is that image which we are importing like this. So here, this image in the end is a JavaScript object, you could say. Or to be precise, it's a JavaScript variable that will point at that image, that will include a path to that image, you could say. And it's therefore that variable, which includes that path, which we want to use as a value for this src attribute. And this here is then the syntax for doing that. What's really important here when using this dynamic value expression for attribute values is that you don't add quotes. You must omit those. Instead, you have the dynamic value, this curly brace syntax here, as a value right after that equal sign, not wrapped by quotes. And with that, you'll see that if you save everything and you reload, you still see that image here, so that still works, but we're now loading it in a more optimal way, thanks to this build process, which is part of this project, and this single curly brace syntax, which we can use in JSX to point at JavaScript values. So
Hi guys, do we have any question or are we still following? Do you understand what the tutor is explaining? Kindly indicate if you are following or if you have any question. Still following. Are you sure? Okay, we're gonna still stumble at a quiz. Let me believe you because you passed the other quiz. When we get to another quiz, I will be very sure that you are still following. So let's continue with the class.
So now that we know how we can output dynamic data, let's go back to components and what we can do with those. Because one of the main advantages of components is that they are reusable. We can, for example, use this header component as often as we want. And if we do that, we of course see multiple headers on this page. But of course, here for the header component, reusing it is possible, but doesn't really make a lot of sense, of course. And that's also quite normal. You will also often build components which might be reusable in theory, but indeed are only meant to be used once. But it's also quite common to have components that should be reused multiple times. For example, here, these core concept items. Here, we might want to build one single core concept component, which can then be reused 4 times for these 4 different key concepts. But every time we're using it, it should be used with different data. Just as you can define a normal JavaScript function once and then use it multiple times, thanks to this concept of working with parameters. So just as you can build and reuse JavaScript functions with different data, we also might want to build and reuse certain React components with different input data. And that's why React offers another crucial concept that's related to components called props. And this props concept is all about being able to pass data into components and to then use that data in there. And for that, here in our project, for the moment, still in this app JSX file, though that will change soon, we can add a new component function, maybe a component function called core concept, since it should be about outputting core concept data. And then here, I want to output a list item where I have an image with a source and an alt tag, where I have an h3 tag with some title and a paragraph with some description. And of course, the goal is to not just have this title and description placeholder, but to instead have actual data that's different every time this core concept component gets used. So now with that component defined here, we can go to the app component, and here in the main area, I'll add a new section with an ID of core concepts. And I'm only adding that for styling purposes here, because in this index CSS file, there is a core concepts ID selector. So make sure you get this ID right to get the same styling as I have it. And then I'll move this h2 tag in here and maybe give it a text of core concepts, and below that add an unordered list. And now my goal is to use this newly added core concept component here in this unordered list. And the goal, of course, is to use that multiple times, but every time I'm using it, I want to pass in different data. And thanks to this props concept, that's super easy to do. You can simply add custom attributes to your custom components. And since these are your components, it's also entirely up to you which attributes you want to set on those components. So those attribute names are also entirely up to you. And here I'll start by adding a title attribute, and I'll set it equal to a value of components here for this first usage of core concept. And I'll add a description attribute, let's say, though in React we actually call that a prop, because that concept of configuring components is called props. And for this description prop here, we could say the core UI building block, for example. And last but not least, we can add an image here. And here I actually want to set this to a dynamic value, because I want to import that image just as I showed it to you in the last lectures. So here we can now import the components image from /assets-components.png. And with that import added, we can use components image, this variable here in the end, and use that as a value for this image prop, written like this now. And that's also important. You can really pass all kinds of values as values for your props. You can pass strings, as I'm doing this here, but you can also pass numbers, like the number 2 if you needed that. You can pass in objects or arrays, really whatever you need. Here I'm passing this data, and with that data being passed to this component function, we now just have to accept and use it there. Now in normal JavaScript functions, you would simply add one or more parameters to accept input values and to then use these input values. When working with React component functions, it's pretty much the same, but you only accept one parameter, which typically is called props, though since it's your component function, you could name it anything you want. But since the overall React concept is called props, this is the name that's typically chosen for this parameter. Now this props parameter will be set by React because it's React that will execute this function. Remember, you're not calling these component functions yourself in your code. Instead, you're using them as HTML elements, and under the hood, React will call the actual functions. Therefore, React will pass a value for this props parameter to this function when it calls it. And the value that will be passed for this parameter to this function by React will be an object. And it will be an object that has all these key value pairs. So all your custom attributes as keys and the values for these attributes as values grouped into it. So one object with these key value pairs. That's what you'll get here for this props parameter. And therefore, in the component function, you can simply access props.image, for example, to get hold of the value that's set on this image key. And if you used a different key here, maybe img written like this, you would have to use the same key up there. So the key you set down there is the key you also have to access up there in the component when you want to use a prop value. So here I'll go back to image written as a full word. And I can of course now also set a value for alt, for example to props title, to use this title as an alt value, and also use props title here for the actual title that will be shown, and props.description here. That's how you can use those values that are set here. And with that, if you save everything, you will see this first element with its content showing up on the screen. And you can now use that same component in different places with different data. For example, here I could set the title to props on this second core concept item here. And with that, I would see props here. And of course, we can now also set the image, description, and so on, also for the other items here. But that's this props concept, and we'll continue working with that concept and finish the other items in the next lecture.
Okay, guys. Oh, sorry about that, Tiago. Your internet is not helping. Oh, sorry. I hope it's better now. Just saw your chats. So before we continue or complete this section, if you have any question, kindly drop it here. While we wait for the question, let's continue with the last session of this particular class. And I think after this session, we will be ending the class for today. Let's go.
Now to finish the other items here, attached you find a new file, a data.js file, which you should download and add next to this app.jsx file. Or you create a new file and simply copy in the content of the attached data.js file. And in that file, you simply find an array with a bunch of objects where every object simply is one core concept that should be output here. That's why in every object you have an image, a title, and a description. And the images are simply imported from the assets folder. So with that file added here in app.jsx, we can and should of course import core concepts, and you should import it like this with curly braces around core concepts from data.js. Since core concepts in data.js is a named export, and when having such named exports, not default exports, in JavaScript you import with curly braces around the name of the thing you are importing. And with that being imported here, we can use core concepts to dynamically set the title and so on. We can access the first item in this core concepts array, which is this object here, and then access its title, description, and so on. So here we can then set title to core concepts 0 title. Do the same here for the description, and then also of course down here for the image set this to .image, which also means that of course now we can get rid of this separate components image import here. So with that, we're using core concepts, and now we can replicate this 3 times and just replace the index 0 with index 1, and then index 2, and then index 3. And with that, we are using the same component with set this to .image.
Okay, sorry, I think this section
Which
is
also
done.
means that of course now we can get rid of this separate component
Having a little bit hitch in internet.
image import here. So with that, we're using core concepts, and now we can replicate this 3 times and just replace the index 0 with index 1, and then index 2, and then index 3. And with that, we are using the same component with different input data, which is now set dynamically depending on the index of the item we're accessing. And with that, if you save that, you should see these core concepts on the screen now. And the great thing here, of course, is that we're now seeing all these items even though we just have one component. But thanks to props, this component is reusable. But what you can of course see down here in the code is that we do have to write quite a lot of code to make this work. Not horrible, but also not optimal. Now, thankfully, we can use a shortcut here. If you have a situation like this here, where your prop names are similar to the property names of the object that contains the data you want to set, you can set the data like this, but you can also instead get rid of all these props and add opening and closing curly braces just like this directly on the component. So not as an attribute value, but just like this, put onto the component tag. And then there you can use the spread operator that's built into JavaScript to pull out all the key value pairs of an object. So in this case, the first object in this core concepts array. And by using this syntax, these key value pairs in this object will be added as key value pairs, so as props, to this component. So this code here will give us the same result as this code, but it is of course much shorter. Though here, of course, we want to use the index 1. But with that, we got a shorter alternative, which we can use on all components. And I'm just keeping the longer alternative here so that you can also still see this. And also because it's, of course, absolutely fine to use this alternative. But you also might want to go for this shorter alternative instead. And speaking of shorter alternatives, there also is an alternative inside of this component function. Here, we're accessing the different props with props.title, props.description, and so on. And this also is absolutely fine and works. As you can see, if you save this, we still see the same result as before. But you can also use another JavaScript feature here in the parameter list. You can use object destructuring by adding opening and closing curly braces here. And these opening and closing curly braces have nothing to do with these opening and closing curly braces down here. They have nothing to do with that. Instead here, when used in this parameter list, these opening and closing curly braces here are used to destructure the first parameter of this function, so the props parameter in this case. And object destructuring in JavaScript simply means that we can target the different properties of the incoming object by name. So here we have to use the same properties as we're setting here as props. So title, description, image. Also here in this object, image, title, description, we have to use these exact same words here between those curly braces. But when doing so, JavaScript will then go ahead and give us these three properties as standalone variables in this function here. And therefore now we can output the image by just pointing at image, the title by just using title, and the description by just using description, hence allowing us to write less code here. And you can use this object destructuring syntax here with that longer or that shorter props version here. It does not matter, it is up to you. If you save this, you therefore now still see the same result as before, but now also with less code in this component.
Okay guys, this is the end of today's class. We have some syntax and notes here. I'm going to be sharing that with you later. So next week we are going to be starting from, I guess, the best practice for storing components. Okay, so if you have any question, please let me know. Let us know, let us know, let us know. This is the end of the section, the class for today, and this is 11 on the dot West African time. The back end class will be coming up in 30 minutes time. So let me know if you have any question. And also this class will be shared, the video will be shared on the YouTube channel, so you can always go and watch it. Gonna wait for 5 minutes for you to ask your question. Okay, I have to go back to the video once on YouTube. Okay, no problem. Yeah, that is what everybody should do. And those who didn't participate, so needs to go back and watch the video. All right, thank you everyone. In the absence of questions, we are going to be calling it a day, or should I say, do well to participate in the backend class if you are interested in learning backend development. And yes, we'll be meeting here again on Tuesday. So stay on the lookout for the course materials and for the link to the uploaded video on YouTube. Thank you all for joining, and do have a wonderful weekend.